There we are. So,
All right.
eighth week. I mean, I know we're not really going week by week, but eighth
Session.
episode or whatever. And today's reading takes us to 576 in our edition, which, to me...
Closed out chapter 6.
Yeah, which
we finished. We read the last 3 sections of the very long chapter 6.
Big chunk there.
And we finished the chapter, so when we reconvene...
Yeah, we'll
be in chapter 7.
Into 7, which not quite the end, right? It goes through 8, I think.
We're a couple hundred pages away from finishing the book.
But yeah. So we're in striking distance, right?
Yeah,
2 or 3 more sessions,
Yeah.
I think, depending. I think this one, in some ways, I feel a little bad. I feel like I complain too much when we get together to talk about this, and I'll own some of that. I genuinely do think there are some problems with this book that I didn't quite expect.
Yeah.
I do think today's reading was better.
Yeah.
Certainly better than some of the chunks that we've read recently. I especially like the snow subchapter quite a bit.
Yeah.
Where he's out on the mountain by himself. But
a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe a Jack London vibe.
Yeah.
With that whole, or some kind of like weird Fargo moment where it's like, damn, he's lost and the snow's shooting everywhere and he's taking shelter in a shed that's not really giving him shelter.
Right. It felt very contemporary in some ways.
Yeah.
Sort of heavily symbolic, but also didn't lean on that so much, and I thought it was pretty deft. So some good stuff. I was going to start with something else, but I'll wait until we get to the actual meat of it. But I don't know. Start us off. What do you? Where do you want to start?
As a general comment, I want to say, that today's reading, of course, began with the background of Leo Nafta. And
also an interesting thing.
I like it when authors do this. It's always been kind of a pet favorite of mine when you're about midway through the book and the author will be like, so when this guy was a kid, and it feels, it's a move that authors do make sometimes that I like, and I thought it was interesting, his sort of Settembrini's accusation of him being a voluptuary makes a lot more sense to me now that we've seen this background. I do not think we are supposed to like this guy or think of him as particularly trustworthy. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay. And then of course today's reading ended with Joachim dying. Mm-hmm. And we get this kind of flash forward where Hans is at his grave site in the valley below. Obviously chapter 7, well, I'm pretty sure chapter 7 isn't going to carry that flash forward. Like, I think we're going to be still at the Barrens, at the hospital, but with Joachim dead.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of something. I guess a thing that I want to say as we do flash forward to Hans being in the valley, which has got to be coming. We speculated on day 1, like in our first video, we said we think based on the prologue that this novel starts in about 1910. And here he is, I don't know, 4 years in now? 3 years?
Not quite. I thought more like 2.
Okay.
I think this is his second winter.
Okay. So we're in about 1912. And I guess what I want to say is, yes, it's interesting, the debate between Settembrini and Nafta that we talked about last time and the politics of it. But like something very real, and Thomas Mann knows this, something apocalyptic is on its fucking way. Yeah. And they're just up here whiling away the time. I'm not saying it's not important to get well when you're sick, but like all of it feels like, wow, when he goes down there, this is kind of where I'm going with this. When he goes down there, it's going to feel like Walking Dead or something, like when Rick woke up in the hospital, Yeah. I kind of feel like maybe that's what's coming, is that part of the project of this novel is to suck us into this dreamy world where love and romance matter, and where, we're fascinated by X-rays, and where we're debating the overall suffering of man and the purpose of God and all this highfalutin stuff, which we've taken seriously in our videos and we probably should. But waiting at the bottom, there's going to be a fucking crater, I think, around the time that he goes down there. So, this squares with my understanding of modernism. Like, obviously, this was kind of Hemingway's point. I know he's an American and Mon's not.
Yeah, but I mean, minute by minute, these two are tracking.
Yeah, and for Hemingway, I'll never forget Farewell to Arms, the opening section of that, where he talks about, words like duty and honor. They just didn't mean anything anymore. All that mattered were street addresses and dates, and just calendar moments.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where we're headed. Like he said that at the beginning of Farewell to Arms, but I feel like Mon's taking us there in this weird way.
Yeah, and I think part of the difference, right, is the timing. Right? Farewell to Arms is more like 1918.
Yeah.
Right, and so Hemingway's coming out of this moment that Hans Castorp is about to fall into.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Although,
and one more thing I want to say about this, and then is that it throws Joachim's whole ethos into such an interesting light to me. I don't really care about Settembrini and NAFTA's arguments about when war is acceptable and when it's not. Like, they're both assholes as far as I'm concerned.
I'm with you there.
And I'm a pacifist, and so World War I still makes me mad because of the fact that there was no reason for it. But Joachim's dreams of being a soldier are all caught up in these ideas that Hemingway was saying don't mean anything, like duty and honor. He's mad at himself for being sick in the hospital when he's supposed to be down here being a good German.
Right.
And damn, he died before he even had a chance to get chewed up by World War I. He died thinking he was a failure.
Right. Right.
When really he was just being set up to be cannon fodder anyway. And Thomas Mann knew this all along. I find that to be a real indictment of militarism, like the way that Joachim died and his sense of self.
Right.
Like, I don't know. I think it's kind of it's feeling like it's on its way to becoming an angry book in that way. So that's my overview. So yeah, I'd like to hear what you think about that, and then maybe we can get into some examples.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back to this, what I think of as a very sort of, and I know he didn't invent it, but I'm just, I guess, telling my age, but I'm thinking of as a very Tarantino-esque moment when we dip into this sort of biographical context of NAFTA. It feels very much like those breaks in Kill Bill where suddenly we're seeing the young I forget the first
the Lucy Liu character.
The Lucy Liu character. We get that great flashback to the animated sort of backstory. It feels a bit like that. But before I get to that, I want to quibble just a little bit with the end, with what you say about the end. I totally agree that the elephant in the room here is all of these forces sort of gathering in the flat land, that are going to just destroy this whole world.
Right.
And there's clearly on practical and philosophical levels, I think, some lines being drawn in the book. Joachim and Castorp are kind of among that I don't know, sorting, I'll call it. But when I look at this very last paragraph for today on 576, I really...
You mean 567?
567, sorry, I really... I got hung up on this. As I mentioned to you in passing, I don't know, a few days ago, I accidentally, because of the way I stuck my bookmarks in, when I first sat down to read for this session, I accidentally read the last few words first and spoiled that.
Joachim Simpson's root-pierced grave.
Right. Literally, those are the words that my eyes landed on.
Yeah.
So for close to 100 pages, I played that game, like, well, how did we get there?
Yeah.
Which is not the worst. I mean, you and I have talked about spoilers, and I'm with certain powerful exceptions, I'm sort of on your team that if the work is good enough, then the spoiler doesn't matter.
Exceptions for me involve pop culture.
Yeah.
Like, I try to avoid social media when I was tearing through Stranger Things.
Right.
And I know
Things like
I know that you and Suzanne maybe haven't finished it yet, so I never talk about that with
Right.
you.
Right.
But when it comes to literature, I guess I'm a little bit like of a hypocrite. I'm like, you know what? The book's been around for like
100 years.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
like if I encounter, spoiler alert, Joachim's dead, it's
Right.
like not the end of the fucking world,
Right. Yeah. And so I'm not saying this as a kind of I guess I'm just pointing out that I had, because of this accident, I had maybe a little more focus on what happens here
Yeah,
in my
yeah.
mind. And I was really curious about about this scene, right? Because we have this fantastic thing like 20 pages into the book where we see Hans coming up the funicular into the Berghof and sort of taking up residence, although he didn't know it yet, taking up residence in this new world, right?
Yeah.
And so part of what really struck me about this paragraph was like after, not too long after this moment where Hans is like, well, I'm just never going back, and that doesn't freak me out anymore.
Yeah.
Now we seem to see him there, and so I paid a little extra attention to this, and there's an interesting ambiguity, right? We let the curtain fall. We have this kind of grand narrative voice.
I
coming
know.
from,
Which, by the way, I mean, when you think about who are the great writers operating today, I think of Cormac McCarthy, of
Right.
course. I think of, well, in my opinion, Gary Steingart. I think you're actually
Yeah.
on my team on that.
Oh, yeah.
He's somebody I love. I think, we have many great writers. Names are escaping me right now. But I just don't think in 2022 you can write that word group anymore.
Right.
Even if you're those people. We let the curtain fall.
I can see
those days
Steingart-
are gone.
Yeah, I can see.
You know?
I can see Steingart doing it, but the way he would do it is he would voice that not through some third person narrative,
Right.
but through this sort of like clumsy, half fluent Russian immigrant
Right.
who's getting it wrong.
Yes.
He's like and we let the window close.
It reminds me, I love it. It reminds me, this is a total non sequitur, but I think sometimes we should tell these kind of stories. It's like when Bernie Sanders was trying to say, I was watching him on C-SPAN one time, and he was trying to accuse another senator of letting the cat out of the bag. And he
couldn't
got
get it.
so excited. He was like, he just let the cat out of the box. And then he pauses and thinks about it, and he goes, or however that expression goes. But yeah, we let the curtain fall, I guess, in 1924 is not a cliche. It's a way writers write.
And it's not even the cliche that stands out to me. It is this intrusion, in a book that's not very apologetic about being narrated.
Right.
It's a sort of extra intrusive
It is.
moment of narration.
It is.
But this is let us take our stand in spirit with Hans Castorp on his lonely height, and gaze down with him upon a damp burial ground in the flatland. And it occurs to me, this could very well be Castorp on the Berghof, still on the mountain, looking down and imagining this.
It could be. That's not how I read it, but that's interesting.
Well, my initial reaction was like, oh, he went down with, I keep wanting to say Aunt Liza, but it's not, whatever Joachim's mother's name
Right.
is. That he went back with her for the funeral,
Right.
as one does.
Yeah.
And then the story continues like, oh, we got back home to the Berghof and so and so. But as I said, I had a little extra time by accident to think about this, and it occurs to me that one of the things this suggests is Castorp imagining this funeral.
Like the flash of the sword. And
Well, I mean, this is all because some of this, I mean, with the Queen's 2 weeks of official mourning or whatever it was, we've had some extra pageantry in our lives.
Yeah.
And part of what we're seeing here is just this kind of cliche, like this is what you'd expect. But it also, I mean, he just really fully joined the Corps, Joachim, when he died, right? I mean, he just became a lieutenant.
Yeah.
Right. Just passed his officer exam, and in fact, I think we never actually see him in his uniform.
That's right.
Right.
Because he changed clothes when he came
Yeah,
back
because he
up.
says there are rules about when you can wear it, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea, the flash of the sword as it rises and falls, hear the word of command rapped out, and 3 salvos. Right? This is the 21 gun salute, right?
Yeah.
The traditional 21 gun salute. And it occurs to me, like,
Fanatical salutes, by the way. That word fanatical, I
Right.
feel like, is kind of barbed.
right. Well, and I think this circles back to kind of where we start in today's reading, which I'll say in just a second. But it seems to me, I mean, I never served, but I have family members who did, and it seems to me, very few things, and I imagine this is not, very different in Joachim's time than it is now. Very few things are respected less than a young lieutenant in
Right.
the Army. Right. This is the know-it-all college boy who comes out of nowhere and starts telling these 10-year veterans what to do and how
Right.
to do it. Phil Caputo, in his fantastic memoir of Vietnam, talks a lot about like the second lieutenant, which is the lowest ranking lieutenant. Just being this awful job in Vietnam. I mean, you show up like, fresh out of Stanford, and this like 35-year-old who's been in the Army for 15 years and has already done 2 tours. It's like, you want me to do what?
Right.
And so it occurs to me, the 21 gun salute, I mean, that's an awful lot of respect for some, brand new lieutenant who hasn't really even done anything. So I'm thinking there's a halfway decent chance that this is Hans needing Joachim's death to fall into that same sort of mythology of honor and duty that he did his part, so of course this community, the society is going to properly honor him, when in fact I think it's probably doubtful that he would have gotten this level of honor.
That's a great point. I mean, maybe I was putting too much stock in the sort of German militarism of it all, like, of the time.
Well,
and I don't know how much German, not that America doesn't have that issue, but I guess I just sort of feel like, in the teens in Germany, maybe it's not about the lieutenant, it's just about making a production out of the military.
Yeah.
But your point is, I think, absolutely valid, that this paragraph, especially with the word group where he says, stand in spirit with Hans Constorp on his lonely height,
Right.
Does leave open the possibility that that's not figurative, that's literal. He's on the mountain imagining.
And he's gazing down into the valley, imagining this thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think it really matters.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting. If it's interesting, it's because here Hans is taking a turn as storyteller.
Yeah.
Right. But what really kind of interests me about this, and it comes back to this kind of militarism and sort of regimented. I mean, it's a joke, right, about Germany. The strictness. Although the couple of times I've been in Germany, it has sort of proven itself to be true.
Well, Mann is German himself, and he has sentences. I mean, if you remember early on when they go to the business office to pay, and he's like, oh, this is very solemn, because they're Germans. They're like, these are receipts and money.
Yeah, paperwork.
I don't know that he is blushing there. I think he's like, no, really, this is part of German culture.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and there is this, I think, for good and bad, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's this sense of, obligation to the community that literally means things like, if the trash is supposed to come and get picked up at 7, like, they're there at 7. And so, there is this kind of regimented, discipline sort of centric, they build cars that actually run, kind of thing. And so, and that, I think, it ties in really interestingly with this flashback that we get from NAFTA.
Yeah.
Who comes out of this apocalyptic childhood.
Right.
I'm reminded a lot of the work I did in grad school, as you know, focused on this kind of mid to late 1800s and kind of regional voices and this kind of like multilingual, multicultural America, kind of before, a lot of people are hung up on this idea that multiculturalism is this really modern thing, when in fact, like 1830 America was,
extremely
multicultural, more so in some ways.
Well, definitely, like you think about, the state of Wisconsin in 1840s.
Right.
That's like largely German immigrants.
Right.
That's just,
true.
true.
And so, you would go to towns and your English wouldn't be so useful.
Right.
Or flash forward to, say, 1910 1910.
Yeah.
And the sort of the Jewish communities in places like New York,
Right.
Boston,
or even in Charleston, South Carolina,
right.
by then.
And this kind of kind of mellifluous sort of mix of stuff. And this really reminds me a lot of those kind of early American novels about especially Jewish immigration, things like Jekyll, and these the kind of things that you'd see in the Atlantic when William Dean Howells was publishing these stories about people coming from these very alien worlds that were really defined by sort of poverty on the one hand, and really like strict social, religious, cultural regimentation on the other, and so we get this young Napta who's coming out of this world. And what an amazing,
Jewish as a kid, and
and what an amazing touch to make his father the sort of sanctified killer, right. And have this be the beginning of Napta's sense that somehow righteousness. There's a line that I should have underlined.
It's at the bottom of 462. The conception of piety came to be bound up in his mind with that of cruelty.
Yes.
And the idea of the sacred and the spiritual with the sight and smell of spurting blood.
Right. And
because his father slaughters animals.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this particularly approved Talmudic fashion. And I just think this is a really fantastic little sort of interruption and insight, and it speaks to the character that I think we've already seen, that Napta is this is partly just on my mind, but it also kind of makes sense, I think. What he reminds me of are those students that you sometimes encounter, maybe not so much here, but maybe at bigger schools, who are 1920. They've maybe read an Ayn Rand novel or two, and they're just they're fully invested in this libertarian idea, and it just makes so much sense. And and they're like, you don't understand. Like, you think it's cruel, but it's because you don't understand.
Yeah.
And the truth of it is, right, that it is this kind of pathology that they're replaying. That is natural enough to replay, I think, when you're like an American kid at that age, but Napta is doing I think a similar thing there, where he's kind of I don't know, replaying this trauma that he's internalized, but it really speaks, I think, to the character that we see later, and then that he parlays this into a place in the Jesuits. I mean, it's kind of, it would, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this without going to hell, but it's one of those things, like, it would be funny except it's true.
Yeah. I mean, well, first there was the anti-Semitic moment on 463, the unexplained death of two Gentile boys, a popular uprising, a panic of rage, and Eli had died horribly, nailed crucifix-wise on the door of his burning home. His tuberculosis, bedridden wife, the boy Leo, and 4 brothers and sisters, all wailing and lamenting with upflung arms, had fled the country. So did I read that right? That they murdered his father because they thought he killed the boys?
Right. I mean, it's the classic escape.
Yeah. So the father's dead. The rest of them, the mother dying.
Right.
They flee to, I guess, Poland?
Something like that. Yeah.
And then she dies, and he falls under the wing of this Jesuit priest.
Doesn't even fall under the wing.
Sees him at a park bench or something.
Yeah, well, he I mean, I think we're supposed to understand that he sort of inveigles this position, and I feel like even the language I just used there, I feel a little weird about, because I feel like there's a certain anti-Semitism in the sense that he's a schemer.
Yeah.
But I think he is a schemer.
Yeah, he is.
And maybe Mon built that out of a certain anti-Semitism, but I think it's just a fact that he is he's also, let me say, as I remind my students, like, trying to survive.
Yeah.
But he gets this position very quickly, moves into the Jesuit campus, abandons his brothers and sisters.
Yeah, leaves them, never speaks to them again.
Yeah, they're just in the orphanage, and
Yeah.
off he goes to this fairly plush life that he feels like he has somehow earned or deserves or something. And I think, once again, we see this repetition that the cruelty is is how he demonstrates, his commitment or his piousness or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think, circling back to where we started a little bit today, I think one of the things that we see in NAPTA is this commitment to a kind of regimen, a kind of systematizing of life that is whole hog, that is absolutely, about every aspect of it, but is also somehow flexible enough to allow him whatever luxuries or excesses or and this is a pretty good life he's got, right?
Yeah.
He's ordained, or no, he's a brother, but he's not ordained. He teaches some Latin, and that's about it. And otherwise, the order takes care of him. He's got this kind of fancy.
What he calls, he says, Hans Consort learned all this in much greater detail. So everything we're talking about, Mon gives you a space and then skips and says, all this in much greater detail Hans Consort learned in the course of visits, plural, to NAFTA's silken cell. I find that to be an interesting translation and word group. Silken cell, I still don't know entirely what to make of that. Like, does it imply in some way that NAFTA is also a captive of this order? Or maybe cell has other connotations other than just jail.
Well, I was going to say, I spent a couple weeks in Fremont, Ohio, several years ago, doing work at the Hayes Presidential Library, which is there, which is a beautiful building. It's the Hayes House that they turned into the library, and it's this amazing, like, 4-story house that is all open in the middle and has this kind of staircase that goes up to the different levels, and you look down. But as you might imagine, Fremont, Ohio doesn't have a lot of lodging options, and I actually stayed at a convent while I was there.
Yeah.
I don't know what the word is, or if there even is one, but it was it's going out of business, right? That they're not sending any new nuns, and the current nuns were all so aged that they couldn't really be expected to do duties, and so one part of the convent had essentially been turned into a assisted
hostel.
living. For the nuns.
Yeah.
And then the other part paid for that by renting out spaces, and the space you rent was called a cell.
Okay.
Because this is what you call the very basic room that monks and nuns kept.
Okay. So silken cell makes some sense there.
Bit of trivia, right? This is also why those cells, like biology cells, are called cells, right? Because it was a monk who found them. He's like, hey, that looks like my little tiny room.
Okay.
So I think
love it.
I think there's this wry twist here, right? That it's supposed to be a monk cell, but it's like covered in silk. Right, so we know what's what. And,
it goes back to Septembrini calling him a voluptuary. Right. I mean, his love of fine things was one of the guideposts of this whole section of the first few pages of the chapter.
Well, and you mentioned Wisconsin earlier, and I feel like one of the things Mon's doing here is sort of tipping his cards, where he's like, we like some nice basic hardworking Lutherans. The Jews and the Catholics, not so much.
Right.
like there's this very narrow Goldilocks band for Mon when it comes to his kind of religious philosophy. I know nothing about this in actuality, but it seems like Mon is not satisfied with the luxury of Catholicism or some of the philosophy of Catholicism. Nor is he all that thrilled with Judaism. So I don't know what
seems to, it may be that he's like putting forth some kind of a secular viewpoint, in as much as our main character Hans, it's very lightweight. Like, he'll do the forms, but he doesn't care. In that way, he feels like a lot of people today.
I think,
and maybe that's what Mon sort of sees as like the way to go. It's like, if you care too much, if you're like super into it, then that's an issue.
Yeah, I imagine Hans as being one of those people who say, I have faith but not religion, or something.
Or I'm spiritual but not religious. The famous
something like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know I think Mon is kind of suggesting that this is the right move.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the reasons I think that, and I'll say this maybe in the hopes of kind of hurrying past it, these interminable arguments
Yeah.
with Settembrini and
Yeah.
NAFTA, I find them unbearable.
Yeah.
I think both of them are terrible people
Yeah.
when they get caught in the throes of it.
Yeah.
I think that they are working on something that is not really about anything they're talking about. I think they just hate each other, and for whatever reason can't work up the gumption to just start punching each other in the nose.
Or leave each other alone.
Now, it did occur to me at one point that in the right kind of adaptation of this, they just start kissing in the middle of
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It is one of those kinds. It's so ridiculously over the top. But I think there are these kind of basic outlines that are maybe worth noting. That that Settembrini is like, oh, but the idea is the most noble thing, and NAPTA is like, the body sucks and the spirit is all that matters, and the religion is not even about truth. It's it's about obedience to this spirit of whatever, and on the one hand, good for them.
Right.
But on the other hand, I find these arguments, and maybe this is just what happens after you spend 15 years of teaching freshman comp.
Yeah.
I find these arguments so just stupidly vague and abstract that I can't think of a single reason to care.
Well, I mean, what rescued it for me, there's a passage, and I don't know where it is, but there's at least one passage where Mon steps in and he's like, people would be startled. Like, they'll be doing this in public, and I can totally imagine that.
People are
like,
stopping and watching.
They're like, really?
Yeah.
And
it's like one of those prank TV shows.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That to me was much more interesting than the content of their debate.
It is so comedic. I mean, I underlined this section on 489, the next to last
Because it
paragraph.
goes on for so long.
Yeah, the next to last paragraph, where they're just arguing with each other, and Settembrini goes, the form, and NAPTA, the logos, the reason, the passion, and it's just kind of like this is literally like the philosophical equivalent of like putting your hands on your hips and thrusting your groin at somebody.
Yeah.
And it's just stupid, and there's nothing redeeming about these two characters.
Well, and I again, going back to how I opened, I think that Mon shares some of our contempt for this, in as much as this kind of florid, over the top rhetoric just to, I guess, be right or something, to one up your opponents. This kind of ideological passion that they're displaying, the kind of nationalism they're both displaying each in their own way. NAFTA would probably hate that, but I think there's a kind of nationalism to which he's subscribing.
Maybe not German nationalism,
right.
but something like that, yeah.
This is what you get. Like, 1917 is what you get. And so, there is this kind of modernist response to this. Again, going back to Hemingway, where it's like, would you guys just shut up? Mm-hmm. Like, really, just shut up. Like all of this is stupid and ridiculous, and you're about to find that out in about 5 years or whatever it is. How little any of this matters in the context of bodies blown to smithereens, and all the rest of it.
I often think about that Mike Tyson thing, right?
Yeah.
Where the interviewer is saying, I think it was Leonard Spinks, I can't remember. Somebody had a plan. Somebody had a strategy. They had figured Tyson out and they're going to beat him. What do you think about that? And the young, very powerful Tyson, kind of still recently out of prison, at his most dangerous, right? Said something like, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right.
And I feel like, one of the things that this book is doing, and I think it's trying to do it, is it making me want to punch them in the face.
Yeah.
And in part just to be like, tell me more about the value of your idea.
Yeah.
Because it's so stupid. Just on the plain fact of it, so stupid that they're arguing about it in this way. I mean,
Well, one of the things that makes it stupid, and this cannot escape any reader, is it's like, man, these guys aren't even like important.
right.
Like, it's not like they, you know, it's not like
Nobody's listening.
nobody cares. They haven't achieved anything. And I mean, I know I sound maybe like an elitist or a snob, but like sometimes, you know, it'd be like if you were just in a bar. Like, we live in Lancaster, South Carolina. You go into a bar and you hear a couple of guys, maybe like you and me, that are just freaking teachers at the local college, or, you know, maybe you're just a line cook or whatever. And it's like, sometimes it's like, really, you know, like, come on.
Well, I mean, I try not to spend much time on social media, but I realized this really interesting thing the other day.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of things for people to be yelling at each other about
Sure.
on social media.
Sure.
But when I see people yelling, and in particular when I see people yelling about what I think of as these far right boondoggles like CRT or trans stuff, there's I don't know if you've heard about this yet, but there's a kind of move afoot to suggest that MUSC is doing like trans work on children as young as 4.
Like over here in Columbia?
Like in the state.
In the state, okay. Okay.
Because there's 7 campuses.
Right.
But and it comes down to there's like research being done on sort of like endocrine blockers for children that has some element of like protecting trans kids from suicide.
Right.
And it is it's a teaching hospital academic study. It's one of those things, that people do.
Yeah.
And it is not,
Right.
any kind of thing like the far right is trying to make it
Right.
sound like. They would have you believe that there's like 4-year-olds lined up around the block, getting genitalia lopped off
Right.
or sewed on or whatever.
Right.
And what I've noticed is the people who scream the loudest about that, every once in a while I will fall prey to the algorithm or whatever, and I'll be like, let me see who this guy is.
Right.
And inevitably,
Yeah.
the two things that this person cares about the most, judging from their timeline, is like whatever the hard right issue du jour is,
Yeah.
and like some really arcane like rules change in college football.
Right.
It's always like those two things, and it feels to me like this is essentially who NAPTA and Settembrini are.
Yeah.
They're these.
They would
frankly,
definitely be in the comments sections
yeah,
online
and
today.
they're frankly they're underinformed.
Yeah.
They're doing all of this. I mean, we were kind of joking.
They're well read, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah, and they're not even that well read.
Yeah.
I mean
that's part of like Settembrini's all these allusions. Part of what I find obnoxious about that is, we all knew this English major.
Right.
That is like quote stuff verbatim, but it's like, so what?
Yeah.
You remember the passage, and I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, like I don't get the sense that since with Settembrini, the whole thing seems to be a universal system of everything, that the world is all explained in a certain way,
Right.
like the suffering, the universal suffering of mankind, and the way, it's almost like every single work of literature he just takes and fits it within this one mold anyway.
Right.
What's the difference between reading Faust and Stephen King if you're going to do that?
Well, and then on top of that, by the time I got done with the argument in today's
Right.
reading,
Yeah, we were grateful for the snow.
right.
Yeah.
What was really clear to me, and then I'll let it go and move on to the snow section, which I actually like quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really clear to me is like neither one of these characters are making any kind of argument that your basic, B- humanities major at a state university, couldn't do just as good a job with if they read a little Rousseau and watched the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
I mean that's basically all.
Right.
I mean, there's not that much going on.
That's right.
I know they're quoting stuff and
It
they're doing,
takes a lot of pages up for
but
what.
they're not. They keep circling back to this. Man is good, man is not, and God is the opposite of nature. And I'm like, put that on a scale and show me how much you can sell it for by the pound, because
Right.
I don't think there's anything there.
Right.
And so I'm really hoping that we get away from this. I know that we really won't for a while. I'm beginning to wonder if we're getting set up to feel strong feelings, and then there's going to be a heel change, or not a face change. What do you call it in wrestling?
A heel turn or a face turn.
Yeah, a turn. There's going to be a turn where these heels become faces.
It could be. I mean, it is
somehow.
It is interesting to me that Hans and Joachim and now 2 other guys keep hanging out with them.
Right.
Because I would not.
Right.
But like they walk with them and listen
remember,
and sometimes participate.
This
So
is, Lawrence Welk doesn't come on.
Yeah.
You got to entertain yourself somehow.
yeah,
right?
yeah. And I mean, Hans, of course, is styling himself as an intellectual, and we've already noted how he, in a lot of ways, is just aping Settembrini anyway.
Right.
Although he seems to be forming some of his own ideas at this point in the reading.
Well,
I think that business with the snow.
And I was just going to say
Yeah.
that's where that really kind of comes into focus for me in
Yeah.
some ways. Although, in a way, it seems like he's marrying, this kind of spiritual and rational. I mean, this feels like a vision quest. What this really feels very much like to me is one of those like early American, like I'm going to go out into the woods and see who I am.
Right.
Absolutely. Sort of scenarios. And it kind of comes out of nowhere. I mean, like he just seems to wake up one day and goes, you know what?
I'm getting some skis.
Yeah. And I just think this is fascinating.
It is, and am I wrong, or this is before Joachim comes back
I think
when he goes in the snow?
I think there's some overlap, but I think the big event where he's like stuck in the storm is before.
That's what I think too, and
Because I think he keeps skiing.
and it's interesting. Like the big book we read before this one together, we didn't record it, but we read Infinite Jest, which the stage for the climax is set by the giant snowstorm in Boston.
Right.
And I couldn't help but wonder if maybe David Foster Wallace, is that right?
Yeah.
If David Foster Wallace maybe hadn't read Mon, because like this is a really elaborate, I think several gorgeous descriptions of just snow that Wallace kind of did the same thing in Infinite Jest, like kept describing, oh, it's falling this way and it looks like this, and dude got his face stuck on the window because it was so cold. And hear me, this passage on 50.
I forgot about that scene.
And then the other guy's like sportscasting it,
Yeah.
But here on 507, I mean, it was nothingness, white whirling nothingness into which he looked when he forced himself to do so. Only at intervals did ghostly seeming forms from the world of reality loom up before him, a stunted fir, a group of pines, even the pale silhouette of the hay hut he had lately passed. I mean, the descriptive powers in the book are legit, his ability to describe landscape and weather and make you feel like you kind of know the layout of the hospital at this point. Like you don't, but you feel like you know where the village is and where Settembrini house is. Like you kind of feel like you could walk there at this point in the book,
Yeah. Or if you happened by, you'd be like, oh, that's this place.
That's the bench,
Right.
And here's this huge snowstorm, and you're right. I mean, it's kind of like a Bildungsroman coming of age novel anyway, and or a spoof of one, or both. I'm not sure, but this is like the kind of, who is it? Joseph Campbell, the sort of hero's journey.
The threshold.
Like, in a way, I felt some of that going on with Hans,
Yeah, I often do that kind of simplified plot chart in my classes for my first year students.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, getting a little whiff of climax here.
Yeah.
Are we edging towards the end of rising action?
Yeah.
We're going up the mountain into a blinding snow.
Yes.
The thing. I mean, we just complained, and I wholehearteded nodded along about Settembrini name dropping all this classical literature. But the thing this really made me think about a lot was this little known Poe work, the only novel he ever wrote, the narrative of the life of Arthur Gordon Pym.
Right.
That is written in the fashion of these polar explorations that were so fashionable during the time.
Yeah.
And there's a lot about this kind of sense of going out into the white,
Yeah.
and the kind of and of course this is Poe is writing this, I think, just after Moby Dick,
Right.
and there's the sense of this kind of unknowability that is represented in this whiteout, that we see in all kinds of things, in pop lit and Stephen King's The Fog is kind of similar, I think, and things like that. But this reminds me a lot of this kind of adventure story where somebody goes looking for something. I'm not sure what he's really looking for. I mean, the sense I got was he's just sort of bored.
Well, what about what he hallucinates when he almost freezes?
But that's the thing.
Like where the old women are tearing apart like a child or something? Like this is over on 518 and 19 and
I think
I know we might be running a little long, but I think we got to address this.
Yeah.
I mean, he imagines this sanctuary, two gray old women, witch-like, bottom of 518, hanging breasts and dugs of finger length were busy there between flaming braziers, most horribly. They were dismembering a child in dreadful silence. They tore it apart with their bare hands. It's like we've suddenly entered... I mean, I kind of jokingly referenced Walking Dead before, but this is like that.
Yeah.
And like, why are you imagining this? Like, what kind of hallucination is this? I mean, I kind of in the margins, I wanted to write, "What the hell,"
Right. Well, and this is part of that broader sort of hallucination or dream where he's in this kind of summertime, field with the high columns,
the
and
flowing water, and
and then there's this great thing on the next page, 520. I had dreamed of man's state, of his courteous and enlightened social state, behind which, in the temple, the horrible blood sacrifice was consummated. You know what I thought of there, because we talk about this all the time, is Omelos.
Right.
That,
right.
This sense, and in the right kind of class, I like to remind my students, that all money is blood money, and it kind of feels like. One of the things that is coming up here is this idea that Hans is forming, that there is this kind of horror at the foundation of this civilized world.
Yeah.
And now he's starting to sound a little bit like what's his name, Nolan's Joker. He's starting to sound a little bit like Rick Grimes, you fight or you die, kind of thing, and I think it's really interesting, right? Because he's having this moment where, I mean, in some ways, he's done this like kind of dumb thing, and I say this as somebody who's done similar things.
Yeah,
he just walked off into the storm and was like, well, we're just going to see what happens.
Yeah,
and he has this extreme moment, and in this extreme moment, he has this weird bit of enlightenment. But also, and I didn't underline it, but a few pages down from here, he's back at the Berghof, and he's like, I kind of remember, but I'm already forgetting what it was.
Yeah.
So it's not like this is so profound to him.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, the descriptive power of this kind of mysterious place, and he does that big circle and comes back to the hay hut.
Yeah.
And it's just it's a really fantastic little vignette.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it means anything much, but I think it's really interesting that we get this, and then we get the second. The follow-up chapter is Joachim's decline and death. It happens pretty quickly, pretty starkly.
Pretty quickly and pretty starkly. And I mean, I guess one of the things that stood out to me was the Hofrat and his behavior during this decline. There was a little bit of the "I told you so" going on. But also, he was rather tender at the end when Joachim died.
They all were.
And so, it was like... I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess he died of tuberculosis. I mean, this whole book, like, they're all afflicted with TB, but I wasn't sure if he just died of something else.
The sense I got, and you're right, they're being shockingly discreet.
Yeah.
But the sense I got was that his larynx got tubercular.
Yeah.
And that somehow hastened this demise. And to be honest, I've actually read more about tuberculosis in the last 4 months than I've read my entire life.
Right.
And I still feel like I don't fundamentally understand. I understand that it's a bacterial infection and that it can not. I thought it was only the lungs, but it can be in other places.
Yeah.
and so my sense is that there was some kind of particular kind of thing with the larynx, because there was that moment where the Hofrat says to Hans, like, yeah, it's the larynx.
Well, and when Hans is like trying to get him to reassure him, he's like, I don't know what you want from me. Like he's gonna die.
Yeah.
That scene.
Yeah. And so, and there's this kind of, it's a weird kind of scene, right? Because we know for some pages, and so does Joachim, and he's kind of saying his goodbyes. He spends some time with his crush.
He talks to her for the first time. Yeah,
he does all this different stuff, and and they call his mother back, and everybody's there for the thing, and even Setembrini is there at his bedside.
Right.
And after he sort of made fun of Hans and Joachim for being those guys who would go, spend time with the soon to be dead.
Right.
So it's a weird. I don't know quite what we're supposed to feel about it. I mean, I'm strangely shocked in a way that I can't explain. I don't think I expected this.
You mean the death?
Yeah. I don't know why. I don't know why it feels important exactly.
Well, and the section is entitled "A Soldier and Brave,"
right,
which I find interesting because I mean I know I started out with kind of a harangue, feeling like Mon is undercutting all of the values that Joachim represents by having him die in this way, and that still is my interpretation. And in an anticipatory way, too, looking ahead to World War I still think that. But this "A Soldier and Brave," I guess, is also like, look, this still is a young man, dying in the prime of his life. Let's be respectful as we can, here. Like, there's a tenderness to that subtitle, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's this vague, although I'm maybe reaching here, there's this kind of vague recollection of that Pietà in Nafta's apartment, just in the sense that it's this image of a sort of young man sort of suffering those final throes.
That's right.
And I don't think, I guess I should be clear, I don't think that we're going to find that Joachim is some kind of Christ-like figure.
Right.
Except in the sense that he's just, I don't know, like in some ways, he's the easiest guy of the bunch to like. He knows what he wants to do. He just wants to go do it, and things keep getting in the way.
And he's had a lot of rotten luck.
Yeah.
And you can sympathize with that.
Yeah. I mean, he's a pretty straightforward guy.
Yeah.
He's kind most of the time. I'm having a hard time thinking of a moment where I thought he was too sharp.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, here's Nafta and Setembrini still, like a couple of bratty teenagers, like still arguing with each other about philosophy at his deathbed.
Right.
And here's Hans, hearing it and thinking like, oh, we got a good lick in there.
Right.
And it's just kind of like, y'all.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think, maybe Joachim, maybe I'm feeling affected here because in some ways Joachim is the one person who I thought, well, I guess if I were like that, I'd be okay.
Yeah. I do. Do you have any kind of an over-under as we move into Chapter 7 on whether or not we're going to see Claudia again?
Well, so...
Because we do not know.
We don't know. Now, there is that suggestion, right? We hear that she's now in Spain.
That's right.
She's left the Caucasus and she's now in Spain, presumably at another sanatorium. And at one point Hans has it in his head that means she's coming here in the next 6 months. As part of her kind of tour.
Right.
I'm gonna say I think odds are very good that we're gonna see her again. I think that circle is gonna have to be squared somehow.
Mm-hmm.
She's a little bit like Chekhov's Madame Machine Gun, if I may. And so that has to sort of come back and get settled somehow. I don't know how.
I kind of feel like it could go either way, but if I were a betting man, I'd say we'll see her again too.
Yeah.
I just don't get the impression though that Hans is going to get the girl.
I don't think he can. I don't think you can.
So I guess we can, prime for the next episode by saying how far we're going to read.
Yeah.
We are starting the final chapter, chapter 7, and we said we were going to try to do like 100-page chunks, so we're not reading this forever.
Yeah. Well, so that in mind, we get to a sub break at 667.
Yes.
Which may actually be, I haven't looked very closely, but I think maybe the only, no, there's a short, so By the Ocean of Time is the beginning of chapter 7.
Yeah.
There's a short chapter there that ends on 583, and then I think it's one long section.
I like
from
667. This will
Okay.
take us to up to the subtitle "Fullness of Harmony." We'll be deep into chapter 7, and so the next time we meet, we will be one reading away from finishing this book, which
Yeah.
will feel pretty good.
Yeah.
Because we started it a while ago now. I mean, it's
Yeah,
been
we
a
did.
couple of months,
Yeah.
or maybe more. I don't even
Well,
remember
this is
the
this
date.
is our 8th meeting.
Yeah.
And they have been 2 or more weeks in between.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ballpark it, and we could look it up, I assume. But I'm gonna ballpark it at like 20 weeks,
Yeah.
give or take.
Yeah.
So 5 months.
Yeah.
And now, obviously,
And some of that was conservative, where we only read, maybe 50 pages.
yeah.
And now we're
But it's-
broadening it.
But it's been on our minds for nearly half a year.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. I'm glad that we picked this one. I'm going to be equal parts, I think, relieved and gratified to sort of be able to say there's a. What's the guy? I'm blanking on his name. The English guy who writes all the lampoons of academic life, Trading Places, and
I can't remember,
and
but I
all
know.
that.
Yeah.
But there's a scene in one of his books where all the faculty are hanging out, and they're playing this game. Like, what's the thing you should have read but haven't? And the junior faculty admits that he's never read Hamlet.
Right.
And then, like, the next week, he's fired. And he thinks it's safe playing this game, right?
Yeah,
He forgot that he's an assistant professor.
Yes, yes.
And so I think that has come to mind a couple times to me. That next time we play this game, the Magic Mountain is safely off my list.
Yes, yes.
I'm ready to be done with it, but I'm also I'm gonna predict, along with my prediction that we're gonna see Claudia again. I'm going to predict that the last 100 pages are going to be the best 100 pages of the book.
I think that's probably right. As we get closer to caught up to real time, as we get closer to, well, according to your interpretation of the end of today's reading, it might be that Hans never goes to the Flatland. I'm still feeling like, we're going to see him in the Flatland before the book is over. I just feel like he's gotta see the mess the world became while he was gone in order for the prologue to fully